and welcome to another booktube video from me, Lauren, from Lauren and the Books. I've just turned the camera on. I feel like maybe I'm a little bit like a Elton John tribute today. I think it's maybe the colours and the stars and the glasses. Who knows? I just turned it on and thought, Elton, how you been? Today's video, happy Sunday by the way, is a video where I am wrapping up all of the reading that I've done in the month of April. I've got 9 books to talk about today, but I am also filming this on the 26th of April, so there's still a few days left, 4 days left in fact, of April. So I've also got to talk to you about a book that I'm almost a third of the way through, just because I think I'll probably get that finished by April, but then it won't be included in May's reading wrap up, and oh my god, then it'll all just have disappeared into the ether. So we'll mention that. But let's start at the beginning of the month. So a few books from the old Women's Prize for Fiction and Non-Fiction long list on these books, on this list. Still, until this month, hadn't read anything that I counted as particularly well enjoyed, but I have now read a book that will be appearing on my best books of the year so far, so feeling, look, definitely will be appearing there, so feeling very pleased about that. So the first book I read is not one of those books. It's The Maiden by Kate Foster. This was a book that was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. It's a historical fiction book set in Edinburgh, and as is the case with quite a lot of these historical fiction books, it opens with someone having been sentenced to death for a murder, and then you go back and find out all about the circumstances leading up to this point. Daphne's cross because there's dogs barking outside. Sorry, Dappy. This was fine, and like I've got to say, like I listened to it, so it was a what's the equivalent of a page turner? I feel like I came up with something for this ear listener. And I wanted to listen to it, and I thought it was very well done. The accents and everything, it was very well told as a story. But I have read better historical fiction, and I've read better historical fiction this year that could have, as in last year, that could have made this long list. So yeah, it was fine, but it was just fine for me. That's that. Next one I read was Has Anyone Seen Charlotte Suter by Nikki French. Got this out from the library. It was on a 2-week back loan, so I didn't have all that much time to spend with it. I enjoy a Nikki French book. I think when I say I enjoy a Nikki French book, what I mean is that I find them very easy to read, sort of pick up with them and get lost in them for the period of days that I read it for. It did take me a little bit longer than usual to read this Nikki French book. And this particular one, I enjoyed the narrative of it and the inclusion of a podcast, because I think a lot of ways that people consume crime these days is through these sort of true crime podcasts and things like that. So this was about the disappearance of a woman, Charlotte Suter, in the 90s, and then it was 2 men who had been sort of involved around the case because there was other sort of deaths and stuff involved in her disappearance, and then revisiting the case via podcast form. So you heard about what had happened in the 90s, and then you were hearing about it now. And I do think that's an interesting way to tell things, because like I said, there's a lot more sort of crime going about podcast form these days. But as is always the case with these particular type of books, and maybe even Nikki French books, is that it all just gets a bit too sort of coincidental at the end, that, oh, someone's just had this thought, and it just so happened to happen while someone was walking across a field, and I made the link of this, and yeah, it all just feels a bit like that. So with the Nikki French books, I really enjoyed the Frida Klein series, and I actually think maybe I'm redue a reread of them, and I might go back to them sort of through audio form, because I really enjoyed them. But I think with these sort of standalone crime ones, there's Nikki French, it's a husband and wife writing team. They've released a hell of a lot of books, and maybe there's some sort of repetition going on now, or stuff doesn't feel as new as it always has done. So I enjoyed the efforts of including the podcast in there. But yeah, for me, I think the actual case itself, I feel like I'd read before, even though I haven't. But yeah, it was fine. And like I said, as always, really got me, sort of was in there, and it's an easy read. 2 stars. Not great, but not bad. Next one up was another book from the Women's Prize for Fiction long list, and another sort of low score of 1.5 stars for Wren The Wren by Enri. Again, this was an audio I listened to it on Spotify, guys, because you can listen to books on Spotify now if you've got Spotify Premium. 15 hours of worth you get on Spotify Premium a month. And I I didn't think this was going to be for me. Also, this is on the shortlist now. I didn't think this was going to be for me, and I sort of went into it, and it sort of captured me a bit from the off, actually, the audio, because it opens with a young woman talking about her period and how she always feels like she's like either preparing for her period, on her period, or making up for the time lost when she was on her period. And I was like, oh yeah, I know what that's like. I feel that. And then it skips to her mother's point of view. And I sort of lost interest a little bit more then. So I was always hoping for the return to the daughter's point of view. There's some beautiful sort of poetry in there and some inclusions, but I just don't know if this sort of stream of consciousness reading and listening is for me, because I feel like I only have to lose interest for a little bit, particularly when you're listening to the audiobook of it, for everything to sort of go a bit, I don't know, I've lost my place. So yeah, it was fine, and maybe I did get on with it a little bit better than I thought I was going to, but I still only gave it 1.5 stars. But I understand it being on the shortlist. Like, I know a lot of people do enjoy this sort of reading, but it's just not for me. Next up though was a 5-star book, but however it was a reread. So it was Bridget Jones's Diary by Helen Fielding. This is the 25th anniversary edition, which is great fun because I love the book anyway, but then this has got like over 100 pages of bonus material from like the beginnings of Bridget Jones, and it's also got writing of Bridget Jones during the pandemic. Helen Fielding talks about some of the things she's been asked about over the years, like Mark Darcy being based on Keir Starmer and things like that. So the bonus material is also top. Like, sometimes you get these books which have the bonus material which isn't that great, but the bonus material in here was good. What was interesting to me this time round is that we read this for my choir book club. I've started running a book club at choir. We only meet a couple of times a term, at the beginning and the end of term. But one person in that book club really hated this book, and it was very interesting for us to have a conversation about how much I love this book and all the things she hated in this book. But I can completely see why she would hate this book, because all the things she hates in this book, I completely agree, are awful. So there's things in there, there's so much calorie counting and fat shaming and fat phobia and stuff like that. But my relationship with this book, this was the first time she'd read it, having read this at various points since it's been published, like I read it as a teenager, I read it at university, I read it a couple of times during my 20s, more times during my 30s, I always go back to it and see myself in Bridget doing the calorie counting when I was doing the calorie counting, and worrying about my weight when I was worried about my weight. And in my head, because I've grown so much since then, I imagine that Bridget has grown so much since then as well. And then I feel like that was sort of reflected a little bit in the bonus material, which the other people didn't have, was when she's talking about her time during COVID. So this is an entry from the 29th of March. Times per hour Googled coronavirus, 247. Nuisance calls to elderly neighbour to see if needs anything, 7. Number of Uber-like texts from volunteer helpline calling self to arms, 0. Minutes spent opening hilarious viral videos and forwarding to everyone I know, 2,457. Time sniffed hyacinths to see if I've lost sense of smell and coronavirus, 282. Minutes decluttering and reading classic literature, 0. Minutes staring at wall, aghast with mouth open, 4,765. And those sort of stats have, to me, replaced the stats that she previously did with calories and how many cigarettes she'd had and how many alcohol units and things like that. So yeah, for me, my love for this book maybe grows every time I've read it, even though there's so much of the bad shit in here that I really don't like. So it's a mad one for me. But yeah, Bridget is always gonna have a big place in my heart, and I love Bridget Jones's Diary. And I love The Edge of Reason, which I might read soon anyway, because I feel like I'm due a reread of it. I love it. So there we go. 5 stars, but a reread. Next up was another low-scoring Women's Prize for Fiction book. It was A Trace of Sun, which I gave 1.5 stars. This has gone back to the library now. Again, sort of started off fine. There was a lot of repetition in this book, and it's hard to talk about this because there's some real big trigger warnings in here for mental health and suicide and cancer, and but a lot of it felt like yeah, like I said, there was just so much repetition. So it's following a mother who has moved over from Granada and brought with her she's pregnant, and she's brought with her young son to go and be with her husband. And we're hearing about the son that she's left behind in Granada and his life there. And then eventually when he reunites with his family later on, and his difficulties in settling in with a family that's already been established in the UK, and yeah, and then his sort of mental health decline over the years, and then slightly might get a bit better, and then the mental health decline again. And I'm aware that happens, I'm well aware that happens, but reading it in a dense sort of book with told very much in a sort of linear way, because you're moving forward in history all the time, a lot of it did feel very repetitive to me, and did feel, dare I say it, a little bit boring. I feel like a lot of the books from the Women's Prize for Fiction long list this year I have found quite boring, which has been like hard to stomach. I love following the prize and I love reading the books despite me finding them boring. I have enjoyed reading as many as I have, but yeah, this was another one that was just a little bit boring for me. But from one boring book to another, I also read 2 books from the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction shortlist. I observed the non-fiction long list when it came out, and thought, and got quite a few of those out of the library, and thought I'd have a good go at some of them. But the truth of the matter is I never thought I would get through as many on the non-fiction long list as I did the shortlist, because non-fiction is a bit of a, I read non-fiction in a different way to the way I read fiction, and maybe you guys are the same, but I sort of dip in and out of non-fiction unless something's really gripping me, like a book that later on in the month, I sort of dip in and out it. And with non-fiction, I think it's hard for me to be gripped by a book about something that maybe I previously haven't had all that much of an interest in. So the 2 books that I read were Thunderclap by Laura Cuming, which I gave 1 star, and I listened to on audio, and it was, I can't even believe I stuck through it, to be honest, because it was so boring. I found it so boring because the topic to me is so boring, and I just found it so boring. It was about the Dutch golden age of art, and that's just not something I'm into. And I gave it a good, well, I read it, so I gave it a good go. I read it the whole way through. And also Laura Cuming, her father is an artist. But yeah, I know this is going to be for some people, and I know maybe some people who read non-fiction in a different way to in the way that I do will have also enjoyed it. But for me, it was a complete yawn fest. Complete yawn fest. And then the next one I read was Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, which I gave 1.5 stars. And this, to me, I went into this thinking, oh, this is probably the one I'm most interested in out of the whole long list, and indeed when it got shortlisted. And I thought, oh yeah, I'll definitely give that a go, because the premise as I understood it was that Naomi Klein had somebody online who was posing as herself. And that's what I garnered from like the stuff I'd heard about it. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And then when I listened to it, I quite quickly realised that wasn't what the book was about. So Naomi Klein was very prolific on Twitter, an author, as is Naomi Wolf, who is an author and very prolific on Twitter, of the same sort of age and race as Naomi Klein. And she would sometimes get mistaken of things that Naomi Wolf had said, that Naomi Klein had said, and vice versa. And they've got very different on the sort of political spectrum. So straight away I was like, okay, well, this isn't quite what I thought about it, what it is. And then Naomi Wolf, her views on things like COVID, mainly COVID, if I'm being honest, we'll focus on COVID because mainly COVID, but other things as well, like Black Lives Matter movement and anti-Semitism and things like that, differ hugely to that of Naomi Klein's. And this, for me, was just Naomi Klein talking about all the mad things that people were thinking about COVID during the COVID years, about it being a hoax, about the vaccine being damaging, about just stuff that I literally had sort of brushed off my shoulder because they're such bonkers views. And this was doing a deep dive into those bonkers views that I already knew were bonkers. And seemingly Naomi Klein agrees with me, but she was doing that, and it was getting me aerated, it was getting me angry, because I was reading this book about something that it didn't end up being what I thought it was about, and also about, it was giving a platform, I think, to a lot of these views which Naomi Klein doesn't even agree with. But yeah, I'll never get that time back, if I'm being honest. And yeah, it made me aerated and angry, so did not enjoy either. But Next up, guys, I read a non-fiction book that I absolutely loved, and it was Reach for the Stars by Michael Cragg. I gave this 4.5 stars. Why not 5 stars if you loved it so much? Well, the truth of the matter is that the writing leaves a lot to be desired. It's written like Smash Hits magazine, like Heat magazine, like all those magazines that I loved during the 90s. And this is following a decade of pop music from 1996 to 2006. And it's got lots and lots of interviews. So there's not really all that much. It's mainly just interviews. It reminded me a bit of Daisy Jones and the Six, to be honest, because a lot of it is just interviews pulled together with different quotes about a particular topic. And we go through chapters about particular bands. Obviously, there's a whole chapter, 2 chapters in fact, about the Spice Girls, which I absolutely loved. Then there's chapters about Steps getting pulled together, and Five and other boy bands, and I really enjoyed reading about that and finding out how the bands got together. And then this particular decade really spans a lot of stuff that had happened during pop music in that time, because we end the decade around sort of 2005 area with Pop Idol and X Factor and Pop Stars The Rivals, of which I enjoyed some very good deep dives onto YouTube, watching some clips from Pop Stars The Rivals and Pop Idol and early X Factor stuff, and loved hearing about the gossip behind all of that. I just had a blast reading this, and I feel like in the same way that Thunderclap wasn't for me and Doppelganger wasn't for me, this is my niche of non-fiction. This is something that I was very, very interested in, and I had a great time reading it. And I think if you were into pop music around this particular time, this would also be for you, because it was a really, really good time. I also had a lovely time reading it. Like, I'm always going to remember, so I took myself, I had to go to Blue Water. You would have seen maybe in a Friday reading vlog. Took myself to Blue Water because I had to buy a gift voucher for a colleague's wedding. And while I was there, I'd driven all the way there, and I thought, oh well, I can't just now turn around and go home. I'm going to take myself out for lunch. So I took myself out for lunch. I had this book with me, and I just sat and read the whole chapter about the Spice Girls, which is about 50 pages. Didn't look at my phone once. Just had a wonderful time, just eating in Rosa's Thai Cafe, reading this. And I'll just always remember sort of reading and thinking about those early days of the Spice Girls and all the things that I loved about them, and hearing it all about it in this book. So yeah, great. No huge points for the most beautiful writing of all time, but just very well pulled together, very gossipy, very fun. And yeah, what I will also say, a takeaway from this, is that I'd always had suspicions that Louis Walsh was a prick. This has cemented it for me. But yeah, it's amazing as well how there was, despite there being so many bands around that time and the music scene being like over the 10 years, the people that were at the top of that are household names. People like Simon Cowell, Simon Fuller, those were the people that were dominating. So even though there was lots and lots of different bands, it always sort of came back to these same men in their lovely ivory towers having a lovely time. But yeah, very, very interesting. Enjoyed it a lot. David's just out the bath. And then the last book, I've literally just finished this today, and this is one that I started reading, I think even last year, and that's The Instant by Amy Liptrot. This is the follow-on from The Outrun, which is a book that I loved a couple of years ago. It's actually been made into a film this year with Saoirse Ronan, and it's a non-fiction book. So and The Outrun is about Amy's recovery from alcoholism. She moves to Orkney and takes part and begins working as, I can't really remember because it was such a long time ago, but something to do with birds and counting a specific amount of birds on the island of Orkney. Well, after her recovery and after that was all done, she decides to move for a year to Berlin, and that's what this is following. And this is following her move from like the quietness of somewhere like Orkney, where she was doing, sorry, that's just David drying his hair, counting birds and things like that, to her now moving to a city and what that's like. And she also becomes a little bit sort of into the raccoons that you're supposed to see around Berlin City. She falls in love during this period as well. She spends a lot of time online, and she ends up meeting somebody and falls in love with them, and seemingly is having this wonderful sort of loving relationship full of excitement and thrills and so much sex and just having a great time. And all of a sudden he just calls it off. And those bits, because I read the last third of it today, those were the bits that I was like, oh God, this is so well realised, because obviously it's her, but like, I've been there where I've been in a relationship with somebody and everything seemed to be going well, and all of a sudden it just wasn't anymore. And I just felt so sad for her. She's almost grieving for this thing that she'd had, and she couldn't get her head around the fact that it had only been a summer, and she'd had relationships that had lasted longer that hadn't affected her as much as this had, and all of those sort of things. And then she returns to Scotland and visits his friend, and it's talking about the friends that have helped her along the way and stuff like that. So yeah, as well as sort of like nature writing. The sort of nature writing that I like a lot really, because it's got the stuff in there about the particular birds and about the raccoons and about stuff that's going on around Berlin, but also it's also got sort of like interspersed with real life and what's happening in her real life. So yeah, didn't enjoy this as much as the Outrun. I think that's telling considering I started it in November and only finished it today. But yeah, still thought it was great and loved the Outrun very much. Really excited about that film. And then lastly, just to say, I am almost a third of the way through Butter by Asako Yuzuki, translated by Polly Barton. We're following a young woman called Rika, who is works as a journalist, or sort of junior journalist. She hasn't really had her big break yet, and she's become quite interested in this woman called Maneko Kaji, who is in the Tokyo detention house, convicted of a series of murders of men that she has sort of seemingly at the moment groomed into relationships and cooked for them and looked after them and made them take her to nice restaurants and sort of given them that sort of experience, and then they've died in what looks like suicide, but she's been charged for this. And Rika has shown an interest in Kaji and has visited her a few times in prison at the point that I'm at, and they're having these really delicious discussions about food, and she's sort of trying things that Kaji's telling her to try, and she's Rika before this point hasn't really shown much of an interest in food, but is now. And there's also some really interesting observations in the same way that I experienced in Bridget Jones, with people around Rika saying to her, oh, you've put on a lot of weight, because previously Rika wasn't looking after herself and she was just eating sort of convenience food when she was starving because she was working so hard, and now she's taking the time to cook herself some delicious food and look after herself a little bit more and treat herself and take herself out for these nice meals. People, men mainly, are saying to her, oh, you've put on a few kilograms, oh, you've done this, or you've done that, and she's sort of devastated, saying, oh, I've got to stay below 55 kilograms, which is just insane. That just sounds like an insane target. But yeah, but there's also a lot of talk about the sensuality of her feeling desirable now she's put on this little bit of weight and stuff like that. So I'm interested to see where it goes. There's moments I'm like, but also moments I'm like, let's see. I don't feel like I've ever read a book translated from the Japanese that's been this long before. I've read quite a few Japanese books translated, and I feel like in all the time I've done that, I've never seen one that's been this sort of chonky. So yeah, we'll go with it. But I'm enjoying it so far, and this will probably be finished by the time May rolls around. So those are the books that I read in the month of April. Let me know if you've read any of these books. Let me know if any of these seem exciting to you. Let me know what you've read in April. I'll be interested, and I'll see you all again soon for another booktube video. Goodbye!